The word had traveled faster than fire through dry grass. Willa heard it first from the scullery maid who brought her morning bread, a girl of no more than 14 winters, who could not meet her eyes when she whispered it, as though the shame of the news belonged to Willa herself and not to the man who had caused it. He has chosen Lady Seraphine of House Velthar as his intended. Willa said nothing. She took the bread. She thanked the girl. She waited until the heavy oak door closed behind the sound of retreating footsteps, before she sat down on the cold stone floor of the chamber she had been given. Not a servant's room, but not a noble's either. Something caught between, like she had always been. And she pressed her palms flat against the floor and breathed. Just breathed. The stone was ice beneath her hands. Winter had come early to Caldenmoor, and the castle walls held the cold the way they held everything else. Stubbornly, without apology. She could smell frost on the air that crept beneath the window shutter, and beneath it, the faint smoke of the great hall hearths, 2 floors below, and beneath even that, if she tried, if she was foolish enough to try, she could still catch the ghost of cedarwood and iron that clung to a man she had been fool enough to believe in. Tristan. Even thinking his name felt like pressing a bruise. She had known, of course. She had always known, somewhere beneath the warmth of what she had allowed herself to feel, that an Omega without family, without rank, without anything but the bond the moon herself had sewn between 2 souls, was not the kind of woman a king chose. Not publicly, not permanently. The bond had been real. She had felt it the moment she had stumbled into the great hall 8 months ago, soaked to the skin from the autumn rains, her gray wool cloak so waterlogged it had left a dark trail across the flagstones. She had felt it like a hand closing around her heart. That pull, that recognition, that ancient and wordless certainty. She had looked across the crowded hall and found him already watching her. King Tristan of Caldenmoor, the Lycan King. A man with long black braids threaded back from his face, ice-pale eyes that caught the torchlight and threw it back cold, wide, leather-armored shoulders beneath a wolf fur mantle that swept the floor when he moved. A scar, thin, silver, barely there, ran from beneath his left eye to the edge of his jaw. He had been standing at the high table, surrounded by lords and war captains and men who carried weapons openly, and he had gone very still when he saw her. She had thought that stillness meant something. She had been wrong. 3 weeks after she arrived in Caldenmoor's walls, brought by a traveling healer who had found her half frozen on the northern road and known better than to leave an Omega unprotected in the wild, Tristan had called her to his war chamber. The maps on the long wooden table had been weighted with iron stones. The candles had been burning low. He had not looked at her when he spoke. "The bond between us cannot be honored," he had said, his voice carrying the same flat authority he used when addressing his war captains. "Caldenmoor requires a political alliance. My mate must come from noble blood. You are—" A pause. The briefest flicker of something across his face, there and gone like a flame caught in wind. "You are not that." She had not begged. She had promised herself she would not beg, and she had kept that promise, though it had cost her something she was not certain she would ever get back. She had said, "I understand, my king," and she had walked out of the war chamber with her spine straight and her hands folded at her waist, and she had not cried until she was alone in the small stone room that was neither servants' quarters nor noble's chamber, and even then she had cried silently, with her face pressed into the rough wool of her pillow, so that no one would hear. That had been 2 months ago. She had stayed because she had nowhere to go, because the northern roads in winter swallowed travelers whole, because the healer, old Marin, had fallen ill, and Willa had taken over her duties in the castle's healing rooms. And the work had been enough, just barely enough, to keep her from thinking too much about the man 3 floors above her, who slept in a room she would never enter, and who had looked at her like she was something precious, and then decided she was not precious enough. And now he had chosen Lady Seraphine. Willa stood up from the cold floor. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes once, hard, and then she straightened her linen dress and reached for her brown leather belt and buckled it with fingers that did not shake. She braided her pale blonde hair. She always braided it, had since she was a girl, and fastened it with a plain cord at the end. She wrapped her gray woolen cloak around her shoulders and pinned it at the collar with a small copper brooch that was the only thing she owned of any sentiment, a gift from Marin, and she picked up her basket of dried herbs and rolled linen, and she went to work. The healing rooms were on the ground floor of the east wing, beside the armory. It was not an accident of placement. Warriors bled, and it was more efficient to have the healers close. The corridor smelled of iron and pine resin, and the sharp green bite of woundwort that Willa had been steeping in clay pots along the windowsill. She set her basket on the long wooden table and began sorting the morning's tasks. She did not expect company. "You heard, then?" The voice came from the doorway. She knew it immediately. Lower than Tristan's, easier, carrying warmth the way a hearthstone carries heat, even after the fire has died. She turned. Edrin stood in the doorframe, one broad shoulder leaning against the stone arch, arms folded. He was taller than most men in Caldenmoor, with close-cropped dark hair going silver at the temples and warm brown eyes that missed very little. He was the king's first sword, his closest companion since boyhood, the man who stood at his left shoulder in battle and at his right in council. He wore no armor this morning, only a dark tunic and riding trousers, boots still muddy from the yard. "Everyone has heard," Willa said, turning back to her herbs. She heard him move into the room. He stopped on the other side of the work table, and when she glanced up, he was watching her with an expression she did not quite know how to name, something between concern and restraint, as though he was choosing his next words with unusual care. "I want you to know," he said, "that I told him he was a fool." Willa's hands stilled on a bundle of dried lavender. "That is not your burden to carry," she said quietly. "Perhaps not." Edrin reached out and straightened a clay pot that hadn't needed straightening. "But I carry it anyway." She looked at him then. Really looked, the way she rarely allowed herself to look at people in this castle, because looking too closely at things you could not have was its own particular cruelty. Edrin was perhaps 10 years older than Tristan's 30, with a face that had been weathered by campaigns and winters into something honest and worn in, like good leather. He had always been kind to her. From the very first week when she had arrived lost and damp and uncertain where she was permitted to sit for meals, it had been Edrin who had pulled out a chair at the lower end of the great hall table and said simply, "Here." She had thought his kindness was loyalty to his king, a soft extension of Tristan's acknowledgement of the bond, even if Tristan refused to honor it. Now, looking at the careful steadiness in his brown eyes, she was not so certain. "Willa." He said her name like it had weight. "You deserve better than what you've been given in this place." The lavender bundle snapped between her fingers. She set it down. "I am warm," she said carefully. "I have work. That is not what I mean." The silence between them settled like snow, soft, particular, covering everything. Outside the narrow window, the castle yard was beginning to stir with the sounds of morning, horses coughing in the cold, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the boot stamp of the changing guard. Wind moved through the bare branches of the courtyard's single old oak tree, with a sound like a held breath. Willa did not know what she might have said next, because that was the moment the door at the far end of the corridor opened, and the sound of boots on stone, heavy, deliberate, a rhythm she would have known in her sleep, reached them both before the man himself appeared in the doorway. Tristan. He filled the frame the way he always filled whatever space he occupied. Not with effort, but with simple, unavoidable presence. The black wolf fur mantle, the braided hair, a few strands loose at his jaw. Those pale eyes, which moved first to Edren and then, with a slowness that seemed almost reluctant, to Willa. Something crossed his face. Then it was gone. "Edren," he said. "The Eastern Patrol captains are waiting in the war hall." Edren did not move immediately. He held Tristan's gaze for one long, deliberate moment, the kind of look that carried an entire unspoken argument, before he straightened and turned toward the door. He paused at the threshold and glanced back at Willa, and what he said with that glance was something no word in any language could have made cleaner. "I meant what I said." Then he was gone, his boots quiet on the stone, and Willa was alone with the king who had looked at her like she was everything, and then chosen someone else. She turned back to her herbs. "Willa, my king." Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. He said nothing for a moment. She could feel him standing in the doorway. That particular weight of his attention, the one she had spent 2 months learning to ignore, pressing against her like a hand against a wound. "I wanted to..." He stopped. Started again. "The announcement was made this morning because the council required..." "You owe me no explanation," she said. "You made your decision weeks ago. I accepted it then. I accept it still." A long silence. "You should not have to accept it," he said very quietly. She finally turned to look at him. And there it was, that expression she had seen only in unguarded moments. The one that made him look less like a king and more like a man carrying something too heavy for his frame. His jaw was tight. His pale eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her chest ache with a fury she could not entirely separate from grief. "Then perhaps," she said, her voice soft and absolutely final, "you should have thought of that before." She picked up her basket and walked past him out of the room. And this time, she did not look back. 3 days passed. Willa learned that grief, when it had nowhere to go, became something harder. It calcified somewhere beneath the sternum, quiet and dense, and you carried it the way you carried a stone in your boot. Always aware of it, always adjusting your step around it, never fully able to forget it was there. She worked. That was what she knew how to do. Old Marin had taught her that work was the one thing no one could take from you. Not rank, not rejection, not the cold indifference of a world that had decided what you were worth before you had spoken a single word. Willa had been grinding dried root and re-rolling linen strips and boiling fever broth for 3 days straight by the time Edren appeared again in the doorway of the healing room, and this time he was not alone. He had with him a boy, perhaps 8 winters old, small and dark-haired, with wide, frightened eyes, and a left arm wrapped in a blood-soaked cloth that someone had tied in a desperate amateur knot. Behind them came one of the yard guards, his expression carrying the specific helplessness of a large man confronted with a small injured child. "Fell from the stable loft," Edren said. "The bone is..." "I can see." Willa was already moving, already clearing the long table, already reaching for her clean linen and the clay jar of numbing salve she kept sealed with wax against the cold. "Bring him here. Gently. That knot needs to come off first, and it is going to hurt before it stops hurting." The boy, whose name was Pip, she learned, the stablemaster's youngest, bore the unwrapping with a silence that told her he was the kind of child who had already learned that crying in front of adults rarely helped. She recognized that kind of silence. She had worn it herself for most of her childhood, in the village she had come from, where Omegas without families were useful when there was work to be done, and invisible when there was not. She worked quickly and spoke to the boy in a low, even voice the entire time. Not false comfort, not empty promises, but a steady narration of exactly what she was doing and why, because in her experience, fear was mostly made of the unknown, and you could reduce it considerably by simply explaining things. Edren watched from across the room. When she had the arm splinted and wrapped, and Pip had been given a small cup of willow bark tea sweetened with the last of the castle's autumn honey, She sent the guard to carry him back to his father. The room went quiet. Outside, sleet had begun to fall, tapping against the stone sill with a sound like restless fingers. "You are good at that," Edrin said. "I have had practice." She began cleaning the table. "Not just the healing." He moved closer, slowly, without crowding her, the way a careful man moved around something he did not want to startle. "The way you spoke to him, as though his fear was reasonable and worth addressing." Willa glanced up. "His fear was reasonable." "Yes." Something shifted in Edrin's expression. Most people in this castle would not have noticed. She wrung out her cloth over the basin and said nothing. The sleet intensified outside, rattling the shutter on its iron hinge. "I would like to speak plainly with you," Edrin said, "if you will permit it." "You have always spoken plainly with me. It is one of the things I value about your company." He was quiet for a moment after that, as though the small confession had caught him off guard. Then he pulled the wooden stool from beneath the work table and sat down on it, folding his large hands together on the table's surface in the way she had noticed he did when he was choosing his words carefully. "Tristan is not a cruel man," he began. "I know that. He is a man who has been taught, since before he could carry a sword, that the kingdom comes before everything. Before comfort, before preference, before—" He stopped. "Before the bond." Willa set down her cloth. "Edrin, you do not need to explain him to me. I understand what he chose and why he chose it. I even understand that in his position, the logic of it is sound." She met his eyes. "Understanding something does not mean it does not hurt." He held her gaze. "No, it does not." The sleet shifted to proper snow. She could hear it change, the tapping softening into something more like silence between flakes. "I want to ask you something," Edrin said, "and I need you to know that whatever your answer is, nothing between us changes. You are not obligated to me in any way." Her hands had gone still against the table. "I have watched you for 8 months," he said. "Not the way the others watch you, not for what you are, or what rank you carry, or what use you might be made of. I have watched you because you are—" He pressed his lips together briefly. "Because you are remarkable, Willa, and because I think you have been so long in the habit of making yourself small that you have forgotten that." The snow fell outside. The candle on the work table guttered in a draft. "What are you asking me?" she said softly. "I am asking if you would consider accepting my courtship." He said it without flourish, without the performance of it, just the plain truth laid on the table between them like a map. Formally, properly, with the full intention of, if you were ever willing, making you my wife. The silence that followed was the longest of Willa's life. She looked at him, at this man with his silver-templed hair, and his honest brown eyes, and his muddy boots, and his habit of straightening things that didn't need straightening. And she thought about 8 months of quiet kindnesses so steady and unpretentious, she had almost mistaken them for ordinary. They were not ordinary. "Edrin," she said carefully, "you are the king's first sword, his closest companion. If you were to— I know what it would cost." He did not flinch from it. "I have considered it at length. He would— I know. It could break— Willa." His voice was gentle but absolute. "I know. I have thought of nothing else for 3 months. And I am still here, asking." She turned to the window. The castle yard below was going white, the old oak tree's bare branches gathering snow along each arm, delicate and accumulating. She thought about stone floors and cold hands, and the particular loneliness of being neither one thing nor another. She thought about a king who had looked at her like she mattered, and then decided she did not matter enough. She thought about what it meant to be chosen, simply, clearly, without condition. I cannot promise you that what I feel will ever be what... She stopped, began again. I am honest with you because you deserve honesty. My heart has been recently occupied elsewhere. I do not know how long the echo of it will last. I am not asking for your whole heart, Edrin said quietly. I am asking for the chance to earn whatever part of it you are willing to give. She turned back to him. Then yes, she said, I will accept your courtship. What followed in the next fortnight was, in its own quiet way, the strangest and most unexpectedly tender period of Willa's life. Edrin courted her the way he did everything, without performance, with great attentiveness and absolutely no pretension. He brought her things he had noticed she needed. A better knife for cutting root, a small iron brazier for the healing room that kept the cold from her fingers while she worked, a wool blanket in deep blue that he left folded on her work table with no note attached, which somehow made it more meaningful than any words would have. He came to the healing room in the evenings and sat across the table from her and talked about the campaigns he had ridden, about the southern provinces he had seen, about books in the castle library that she might find useful, about nothing in particular. He made her laugh twice in the first week, which startled her both times. He did not push. He did not demand. He held the door of whatever space she needed and waited, patiently, for her to choose to step through it. The castle noticed. Of course, the castle noticed. Castles were living things, made of stone and rumor in equal measure, and news of the king's first sword openly courting the Omega healer moved through the corridors and kitchens and guard rooms within 3 days. Most of the reaction was cautious curiosity. Edrin was well respected, steady, known for his judgment, and if his judgment told him this woman was worth his attention, then perhaps she was worth a second look. Some of the reaction was less generous. Lady Seraphine of House Velthar arrived at Caldenmoor on the 14th day after the announcement, in a carriage of lacquered dark wood, drawn by 4 gray horses, accompanied by a retinue of attendants, 2 brothers, and a cold-faced steward who immediately began making demands about chamber arrangements. She was beautiful in the way that certain weapons were beautiful, precisely, intentionally, with an edge to it. Dark hair pinned elaborately beneath a silver circlet, dark eyes that moved around every room like they were calculating its worth. She wore silk even in the cold, layers of it in deep green and silver, and she smelled of rosewater and ambition. Willa encountered her on the 3rd morning, in the corridor outside the great hall. She had not expected it. She had been carrying her herb basket, head slightly bowed against the draft from the hall's main entrance, and she had nearly walked directly into the woman before she looked up. Lady Seraphine stopped. Her dark eyes moved over Willa with the slow deliberation of an assessment, taking in the gray cloak, the plain linen dress, the copper brooch, the simple braid. You are the healer, she said. It was not a question. Yes, my lady. The one Edrin has been attentive to. Another pause, the word placed with precision. I am not certain I would describe it that way, Willa said carefully. Lady Seraphine smiled. It did not reach her eyes. You are an Omega without bloodline or title, and the king's first sword has decided you are worthy of his time. She tilted her head, her silver circlet catching the corridor's torchlight. I find I am curious what it is you have that earns such attention. Willa met her gaze and said nothing. The lady's smile sharpened slightly. Be careful, healer. Men in positions of power rarely make decisions in a castle that do not have consequences for the people around them, and consequences have a way of falling on those least equipped to carry them. She walked on. Willa stood in the corridor for a moment after she had gone, her basket held still against her hip. It was not a threat, precisely. It was something more unsettling than a threat. It was a truth wrapped in one, and delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had no doubt about which direction the weight of this castle fell. She turned and walked back toward the east wing. She did not see, because she was not looking, the figure that had emerged from the doorway of the great hall in time to witness the entire exchange. Did not see him standing very still in the arched entrance, one hand against the stone frame, pale eyes tracking her retreating back, with an expression that no one in Caldenmoor had ever seen on the face of their king before. It looked, to the single guard who happened to glance over, something very close to devastation. The snow did not let up. For 7 days, it fell on Caldenmoor without pause, burying the yard in white silence, sealing the castle gates against travel, pressing the entire kingdom inward on itself like a fist slowly closing. The great hall fires burned through the night, and still the cold crept under doors and through window cracks, and settled into the stone walls with a permanence that felt almost personal. Willa did not mind it. She had grown up in cold places. What she minded was the way the castle had begun to shift around her, subtle as the movement of ice on a winter river, slow and structural and impossible to stop once it had begun. Lady Seraphine had been at Caldenmoor for 10 days, and in that time she had rearranged the social gravity of the place, the way a heavy stone rearranges water. Lords who had previously nodded to Willa in the corridors now looked past her. Kitchen servants who had chatted with her at the herb stores now found reasons to be elsewhere. Even the 2 young healers who assisted her in the East Wing had grown quieter, less certain of where their loyalties were permitted to land. None of it was spoken. That was the nature of it. It was all in the slight redirections of eye contact, the conversations that stopped a beat too late when she entered a room, the particular quality of silence that told her she had become, once again, the thing she had spent her whole life being, a presence that was useful and therefore tolerated, but not quite belonging. She told none of this to Edren. He would have done something about it, and she did not want something done. She had survived this before. She would survive it again. What she could not have anticipated was the morning the War Council summoned her. She had been in the healing room at dawn, feeding the small iron brazier Edren had brought her, when the guard appeared, young, uncomfortable, clearly drawing the short end of some assignment. "The king requests your presence in the war hall, healer." She set down the fire iron. "Does he?" "Yes, my lady." The guard caught himself. "That is... yes, he does." The war hall was on the 2nd floor of the North Tower, reached by a staircase of worn stone that curved upward through cold air, smelling of torch smoke and old timber. Willa climbed it with her hands folded, and her breathing even, and her heart doing something complicated in her chest that she chose to categorize as irritation. The hall was not empty. Tristan stood at the long table with 3 of his senior war captains and his council steward, a thin man named Corvath, who had always regarded Willa with the particular wariness he reserved for things he could not easily classify. Maps were spread across the table, held flat by iron river stones. Candles burned in their iron stands. And Edren, she had not expected Edren, stood at the far end of the table, his expression carefully neutral in the way it only was when he was actively working to keep it that way. She understood immediately that something had happened. "Close the door," Tristan said, not looking up from the map. The guard obeyed. The latch settled with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. "There is a sickness," Tristan said, still looking at the map. "In the village of Ashford, 2 days east on the Valley Road. My scouts report it began 3 weeks ago as fever and has since taken 11 lives. The village healer died among the first." Willa stepped closer to the table. She looked at the map, at the small mark that indicated Ashford, nestled against the base of the eastern ridge, surrounded by the notation of a river on its south side. "What are the symptoms?" she said. "Fever first, then a darkening of the skin at the throat and wrists, then loss of voice. Then, within 7 days of the first fever, death." Tristan's jaw tightened. "It is moving. 3 families from Ashford fled to the next village before they understood what they carried. We now have reports from Greyvale as well." 2 settlements. She studied the map. The river, she noted, ran from Ashford directly into the valley that fed Greyvale's well system. The river, she said. They share water. The room went quiet. The water source, she said again, looking up. If the sickness began in Ashford and spread with the families who fled, that is travel-borne spreading. But if Greyvale is showing signs among people who had no contact with Ashford families, then the river has carried it. She looked at Tristan directly for the first time since entering the room. You need to know which it is before you decide how to respond. Because if it is the water, then every settlement downstream is already at risk. He was watching her with those pale eyes, and she had become, over months of practice, fairly accomplished at not letting that affect her. Fairly. Can it be treated? He asked. I need to see it. She said it plainly, without drama. I know of 2 illnesses that produce throat darkening. One responds to copper root compound steeped in clean water. The other... She paused. The other does not respond to anything I know of. But it can be slowed, and the suffering eased. To know which this is, I need to examine the sick. You would go yourself, Edran said from the far end of the table. It was not quite a question. Old Marin could have identified it from the description, Willa said. I cannot. I am not as experienced as she was. I need to see it. Another silence. She was aware, without looking, of Corvath the steward making some small disapproving gesture, the sort of gesture that contained an entire opinion about Omegas who spoke in war councils as though their words carried weight. I will send an escort, Tristan said. 4 guards and a supply cart, she said. And someone who knows the valley road, because if the snow continues, the lower ford will be impassable, and we will need the ridge route. She heard Corvath exhale through his nose. She did not look at him. Idrin will lead the escort, Tristan said. Something moved across Idrin's face. Not objection exactly, but awareness of the shape of this situation. The particular geometry of what it meant for Tristan to send his closest companion to escort the woman Edran was courting into potential danger. I will have the cart ready by midday, Idrin said simply. The road to Ashford was brutal. The snow had packed hard on the valley track, and the cart's iron-bound wheels broke through the crust with every turn in a sound like cracking bone. Willa rode in the cart's bed rather than on horseback, not because she could not ride, but because she had spread her herb supplies across the boards and needed to keep them organized and accessible, and because the motion of a horse in snow this deep was unpredictable enough that she did not want to be responsible for a broken jar of copper root tincture. Edran rode alongside the cart. He did not attempt conversation over the noise of travel. Another thing she had come to appreciate about him: his understanding of when words were useful and when they were simply sound. Occasionally he dropped back to check the rear guard, or moved ahead to assess the road. Each time he returned, he settled back to the same position beside the cart, steady and unhurried as a compass needle finding north. They reached Ashford at dusk. The village was small, 30 houses at most, timber-framed with thatched roofs sagging under the snow's weight, a central well, a smithy, a tiny stone-walled shrine to the moon. It smelled wrong before they entered it. A smell Willa knew from Marin's teaching. Something sweet beneath the wood smoke, cloying and particular. The smell of fever, sweat, and illness concentrated in an enclosed space. The village headman met them at the edge of the road. He was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered and hollow-eyed in the way of a man who had not slept properly in weeks. His name was Dovin, and when he saw Willa climb down from the cart, he looked at her with an expression she recognized. The look of a person who has been hoping so hard for help that the arrival of anything remotely resembling it threatens to break something they have been holding tightly closed. "How many sick?" she asked him, before he could begin apologizing for the state of the village, or thanking her excessively, both of which she could see he intended to do. 14 still living, he said. 7 in the mill house, which we made into a sick room. 7 more in their own homes. The 7 in their homes? Have they been isolated, kept from shared water sources? We sealed the well 5 days ago when I understood what the river was doing. His voice dropped. But the damage was already done. She looked at Edrin. His expression was grim and steady. He nodded once. Go. I will see to the guards and the cart. She followed Dovin to the mill house. What she found inside stripped away everything except the work. 14 people, ranging from a grandfather of perhaps 70 winters to a young woman of about Willa's own age, 23, perhaps 24, lay on pallets arranged in rows across the mill's stone floor. Someone had built a fire in the central iron grate and packed it high with wood, but the heat barely reached the edges of the room. The smell was worse inside. 3 of the 14 were beyond the stage of fever. Their skin at the throat and wrists showed the dark bruising discoloration she had been told about, a deep purple-black like old ink soaked into the flesh. She worked through the night. She moved from pallet to pallet with her candle and her herb bag and her small copper instruments, examining throats and wrists and eyes and tongue color, taking in the particular constellation of symptoms the way Marin had taught her to read illness as a language with its own grammar. By the second hour, she was certain of what she was facing, not the untreatable kind. She said a quiet word of gratitude to whatever force watched over healers and fools, and then she went to the door and found Edrin waiting in the cold outside it, not pacing, not impatient, simply there, as though he had positioned himself between her and whatever might come from the dark. I need the copper root, she said. The large clay jar, sealed in red wax, and the dried willow bark bundle, and the clean water we brought. All of it boiled, not simply heated, boiled. Can you build a fire large enough? Yes, he said. And Edrin. She put her hand on his arm without thinking. He went very still, not pulling away, just still. Tell Dovin the well can be reopened in 10 days if the river upstream is blocked for the same period. The source of contamination is something dead in the water higher up the ridge. If it is removed and the water runs clear for a week, the sickness will not continue to spread. He looked at her hand on his arm and then at her face, and something in his expression was so quietly, carefully tender that she felt it somewhere beneath her sternum. Not the same as the bond pull she had felt with Tristan, nothing so sharp or involuntary, but something real and growing, like the first warmth after a long cold. You are going to save them, he said. It was not flattery. It was an observation, stated with the same matter-of-fact certainty he brought to everything. Most of them, she said honestly. If I am quick enough. She went back inside. She did not see, because she was focused on her work, and the night was dark, and the snow was falling again. The rider who had come up the valley road an hour behind their party, and now sat on a dark horse at the edge of the village, half concealed by the tree line. Did not see him watching the lit window of the mill house, with an expression carved so deep it looked less like feeling and more like the permanent mark of it. Did not see Tristan, who had told his council he was riding the northern perimeter, and had instead ridden east, alone, in the snow. Pull his horse to a stop when he saw the light in the mill house window and the shadow of a woman moving within it, steady and purposeful and entirely unaware of being watched. Did not see him sit there in the cold and the dark for a long time, and then turn his horse and ride back toward Caldenmoor alone. She saved 11 of the 14. The 3 she lost were the ones already deepest in the darkening, the grandfather and 2 others whose fevers had burned too long before she arrived. She sat with each of them as they went, because Marin had taught her that no one should die in the presence of only strangers, and because it was the only thing left she could give them when the medicine ran out. Edrin found her on the morning of the 3rd day sitting on the mill house step in the pale gray dawn, her gray cloak wrapped around her, her hands resting open on her knees with the particular emptiness of hands that have been working for a very long time. The snow had stopped. The sky above the eastern ridge was the color of cold iron, just beginning to soften at the horizon toward something that might eventually become light. He sat down beside her without speaking. She did not speak either. They sat in the quiet of the waking village, a cock crowing somewhere, the sound of the guards moving in the yard, the distant creak of the mill's frozen wheel in the wind. And the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that had been built slowly enough to bear weight. "We should start back today," she said finally, "when you are ready." "I am ready now." She paused. "I need to speak with Dovin first, about the upstream blockage. And I need to leave written instructions for whoever takes over the sick room, because the 11 who are recovering will need the copper root compound for another 8 days, and the measurements must be precise. I will have the cart loaded while you speak with him." She turned to look at him. The dawn light was strengthening, catching the silver at his temples, the steadiness in his brown eyes. There was mud on his boots, and his dark tunic was creased from 3 days of sleeping in his riding cloak, and he had not complained once, not about the cold or the road, or the long waiting hours, or the weight of what she was doing inside that building. "Thank you," she said, "for staying. There is nowhere else I would have been." It was a simple sentence. He said it simply. But it landed in her chest with a solidity that made her understand, for the first time with real clarity, that what Edrin was offering her was not comfort as a substitute for something else. It was something that stood entirely on its own. She stood, shook the cold from her cloak, and went to find Dovin. The road back to Caldenmoor took most of the day. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat, hard bread and salt pork from the supply cart, eaten sitting on a fallen log at the roadside while the guards watered the animals at a stream that ran clear and cold between snow-covered banks. Adrian handed her his portion of the bread when he noticed she had eaten hers too quickly, which was the kind of observation that required having paid genuine attention, and she accepted it without protest, which was the kind of acceptance that required trusting that taking something from someone did not put you in their debt. She was thinking about that, about trust and debt, and what she had been taught about the difference, when Edrin said, without preamble, "Tristan rode to Ashford." She looked up sharply. "Not to the village," Edrin said. He was looking at the stream, his elbows on his knees, his bread untouched. He stopped at the tree line. One of the rear guards saw him. He did not come in, did not announce himself, did not... A pause. He sat there for some time. Then he left. The cold of the log beneath her seemed to deepen. "Why are you telling me this?" she said carefully. Adrian turned to look at her. His expression was honest in the way she had come to rely upon. No management of the information. No softening of it into a shape more convenient for her to receive. "Because I am courting you," he said, "and I believe you deserve to know the things that concern you, even the things that are uncomfortable." He held her gaze. "And because I will not build something with you on a foundation of omission." She looked away toward the stream. The water moved over the stones with a sound like continuous, patient industry. "He made his choice," she said. "Yes," Edrin agreed. "He did." The word sat between them, neither of them adding to it. Somewhere above the bare trees, a crow called once and fell silent. They reached Caldenmoor as the sun was dropping behind the western ridge, painting the castle's stone towers in bands of amber and cold shadow. The gates opened for them, and the yard was its usual late-afternoon self. Grooms appearing for the horses, guards changing at the inner posts, the smell of the evening meal already drifting from the kitchens, roasted meat and wood smoke, and the iron-sweet smell of the forge still cooling for the day. Willa climbed down from the cart and reached back for her herb basket, and when she turned around, Lady Seraphine was standing in the yard. She was not alone. She had 2 of her attendants with her, and one of her brothers, a broad young man with her same dark hair and calculating eyes. And she was dressed in a deep green riding cloak that made the yard look drab by comparison. She looked at the mud-spattered cart, at the tired guards, at Edrin swinging down from his horse, and then at Willa. And she smiled the smile that did not reach her eyes. "The healer returns," she said. "We heard there was sickness in the valley villages." "There was," Willa said. "There is less of it now." How admirable. The word was perfectly calibrated, not quite sarcastic, not quite sincere, occupying the precise space between them where it could not be challenged directly. "You must be exhausted. 3 days on the road in this cold." Her gaze moved to Edrin. "How good of you to accompany her, Edrin. Though I confess I wondered whether the king's first sword was best deployed escorting a healer on a village errand, when there is so much requiring his counsel here." Edrin looked at her with the particular quality of patience that was not patience at all, but its disciplined cousin. "The king directed the escort," he said. "I followed his direction." "Of course." Another smile. "I only hope the errand was worth the investment. 11 people are alive who would not be otherwise," Willa said. Her voice was pleasant and level. "I believe that is a reasonable return." Something flickered in Lady Seraphine's dark eyes. Not anger, exactly, but a recalibration. A recognition that the thing she was measuring had more structure to it than first assessed. Her brother said nothing. He simply watched Willa with an expression she could not fully read. She excused herself and went inside. That night, a fire was lit in the great hall for the evening gathering, a custom in Caldenmoor on the first clear night after snowfall, when the court came together with wine and song and the pretense of warmth. Willa would not normally have attended. She was not court, not noble, not wife of someone who was either. Edrin came to the healing room an hour before. He had changed into a clean tunic of dark blue wool, his hair brushed back, his boots newly tended. He looked, she thought, like a man who had decided something and was at peace with having decided it. He carried in his hand a length of deep blue ribbon, simple, fine woven, the color of the blanket he had brought her. "I would like to escort you to the gathering tonight," he said, "if you are willing." She understood what he was asking, beneath the asking. He was asking her to stand beside him publicly. He was asking her to be seen, not as the Omega healer in the East Wing, not as the woman the king had declined, but as the woman Edrin had chosen. He was asking her to let him place himself between her and whatever interpretation the court wished to make of her presence. She took the ribbon from his hand. "Give me a moment to change my cloak," she said. The great hall was warm with bodies and firelight, the long trestle tables pushed to the walls to open the central space, torches burning in their iron brackets, the smell of pine resin and heated wine and beeswax candles thick in the air. A small group of musicians played near the hearth, a fiddle and a bone flute and a hand drum. And the sound wove through the conversation of perhaps 50 people gathered in clusters across the flagstones. Willa walked in beside Edrin. She had changed nothing about her clothing. The same gray cloak over the same linen dress, the copper brooch at her throat. But she had rebraided her blonde hair and woven the blue ribbon through it, and she carried herself the way she had learned to carry herself in the 3 days of Ashford, when there had been no room for hesitation or apology, or the habitual smallness she fell into when she was uncertain of her welcome. The hall noticed them. She felt it move through the room like a current, the slight redirections of attention, the quiet comments behind hands. She did not look for Tristan. She found him anyway, in the way you always found certain things you were trying not to look for, by the simple fact of being aware of where they were. He stood at the far side of the hall near the hearth, a cup in one hand, his black fur mantle over his shoulders, those pale eyes already on her. Lady Seraphine stood beside him in her green silk, saying something to a lord on her other side, her hand resting lightly on Tristan's arm. Willa looked away. Edrin drew her toward a group of his men, senior guards and their wives. Solid, steady people who made space for them without fuss and offered wine and asked about Ashford with the genuine interest of people who knew the valley villages and had family in them. Willa answered, and the conversation was real and warm, and she found herself, after a time, not performing ease, but actually feeling something close to it. She was mid-sentence, describing the millhouse fire and the copper root compound, when she felt it. Not the bond pull. She had learned to wall that off, to manage it the way you managed a wound that was healing by simply not pressing on it. This was different. This was the specific sensation of being watched with an intensity that had heat in it. She turned her head slightly. Tristan was no longer near the hearth. He was closer. Not so close as to be obvious. Perhaps 12 feet away, near the edge of the central space, his cup still in his hand. He was not looking at her now. He was looking at a point on the middle distance with a studied blankness she recognized as the face a man made when he had been caught looking and was pretending he had not been. Lady Seraphine was watching from across the room with those calculating dark eyes, and for the first time her expression held something underneath the calculation that was unmistakably real. It was not discomfort. It was the beginning of something that looked like genuine alarm. The musicians shifted into a slower melody, and Edrin turned to Willa and offered his hand with a questioning look, and she put her hand in his and let him lead her onto the floor. She did not look at Tristan again, but she felt his gaze on her back for every step of every measure of that dance, steady and burning and far too late, like sunlight reaching a place after the coldest part of winter had already done its damage. Later, much later, when the fires had burned low, and the gathering had thinned, and Edrin had walked her back to the east wing with a quiet good night and a brief, careful pressure of her hand. She leaned against the closed door of her room and pressed her fingertips to her sternum where the ache lived. It was smaller than it had been, not gone, but smaller. She thought about that for a while in the dark, listening to the wind move around the castle walls. Then she lit her candle, opened the small leather journal Marin had given her, and wrote down the copper root compound measurements for Ashford, so she would not forget them. Work, she thought. There was always work, and underneath the work, something else was growing. Slow and undemanding and real, the way things grew in cold climates, without display, without certainty, but stubbornly, and with deep roots. She was not sure yet what to call it, but for the first time since she had walked out of Tristan's war chamber 2 months ago, with her spine straight and her hands folded and her heart in pieces, she thought that perhaps calling it anything at all could wait until she was ready. She blew out the candle. She slept without dreaming of pale eyes. The announcement came on a Tuesday. Willa heard it from Edrin himself, which was the only reason she did not hear it the way she had heard everything else in this castle. Second-hand, softened by the passage through other mouths, arriving already shaped by someone else's interpretation. He came to the healing room in the early morning, before the rest of the castle had fully woken, and he stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides, and his expression carrying the particular quality of a man who is about to say something that will change the shape of a conversation permanently. "Tristan has called off the betrothal," he said. Willa set down the clay jar she was holding. Carefully. "When?" "Last night, after the gathering. He summoned Corvath and the council steward and dissolved the arrangement formally. Lady Seraphine and her party will depart Caldenmoor by week's end." He paused. Her brother challenged the dissolution. Tristan reminded him with some force that Caldenmoor does not negotiate under threat. She said nothing for a long moment. Outside, the first sounds of the yard were beginning, the horses, the guards, the distant hammer of the smithy waking. "Did he say why?" she asked. Edrin's expression did not change. "He said the alliance no longer served Caldenmoor's interests." "That is a political answer." "Yes," Edrin said quietly. "It is." She looked at him. at this man who had offered her something real and uncomplicated and patient, who was standing in her doorway now delivering news that complicated everything, and who was watching her with steady brown eyes that held no manipulation, no agenda, nothing but honest attention. "Edrin," she said carefully, "what do you want me to do with this information?" "Nothing," he said. "I am telling you because you deserve to know, not because I expect it to change anything." He held her gaze. "What happens between you and Tristan is not something I will place a wall in front of. I told you from the beginning. I am asking for the chance to earn what you are willing to give. I meant it then. I mean it still." She looked at him for a long time. Then she crossed the room and took his hand between both of hers, his large, scarred, honest hand, and she held it for a moment without speaking. "You are a remarkable man," she said. "You are the second person to say that to me," he said. "The first was my mother, which I always suspected was not entirely objective." She laughed. It came out of her before she could manage it, and it surprised them both. And then Edrin smiled. A real smile, the rare unguarded kind. And for that moment, the cold room with its clay pots and dried herbs and small iron brazier was the warmest place in Caldenmoor. Tristan found her in the castle's inner courtyard that afternoon. She had gone there to gather fresh snow to pack around a fever compress, a trick of Marin's she had almost forgotten, and she was crouched beside the courtyard's old oak tree with a clay bowl in her hands when she heard his boots on the stone and looked up. He stood 10 feet away. No mantle today, just his leather armor and the crossed straps at his chest, his black braids loose at his shoulders in the cold wind, his pale eyes finding her with an immediacy that told her he had known exactly where she would be. She stood. She did not put the bowl down. "Willa," he said. "My king." Something moved across his face at that. The title, the distance of it. "I dissolved the betrothal," he said. "I heard. I should have—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. He was not a man accustomed to the particular difficulty of the next word, and she could see him working toward it with the same effort he would have applied to a battle's hardest ground. "I made a decision 8 months ago that I told myself was duty. I told myself that what I felt was less important than what the kingdom required." The wind moved through the oak's bare branches above them, dropping a small scatter of snow from the highest limbs. "And now," she said, "and now I have watched Edrin look at you." His voice was low and even and cost him something. "And I have watched you begin to look back. And I understand that I have no right to stand in front of that. No right at all. Because I chose this." He met her eyes fully. "But I need you to know that what I said to you in the war chamber, what I allowed to happen, it was the greatest error of judgment I have ever made. Not politically, not strategically." His voice dropped further. "As a man." Willa looked at him, at this king who had held the fate of an entire kingdom in his hands, and chosen the kingdom over her, and who was standing now in a cold courtyard, telling her what it had cost him with a directness that was almost unbearable in its honesty. She felt the bond between them. She always felt it, had never stopped feeling it, had only learned to live alongside it the way you lived alongside a scar. It was real. It had always been real, and it was not enough on its own to make right what had been broken. "Tristan," she said quietly, "I believe you. I believe every word of it." She shifted the clay bowl in her hands. "And I need you to understand that believing you does not give me back the 2 months I spent learning to stop hoping, does not give back the morning I heard about Lady Seraphine from a girl who could not look at me, does not give back what it cost me to keep walking through this castle every day as though I was not—" She stopped, breathed, "as though I was not half undone." He said nothing. He took it without flinching, which was the only right response to it. "Edrin is a good man," she said. "A better man than most. And he chose me when choosing me cost him something. That matters to me. She held Tristan's gaze. I cannot set that aside simply because you have realized what you gave up. The wind picked up, moving her gray cloak, lifting a strand of blonde hair from her braid. I know, Tristan said. I am not asking you to. She waited. I am asking only... He exhaled. I am asking that you know it was real. What I felt, what the bond was. I need you to know I did not refuse it because it meant nothing. She looked at him for a long moment. The pale eyes, the scar along his jaw. The weight of a man who had carried a kingdom on his back so long he had forgotten how to put it down long enough to hold something else. I know, she said at last. I have always known. She picked up her snow-filled bowl and walked back toward the east wing. He did not follow. Lady Seraphine left Caldenmoor on a gray Thursday morning without ceremony. Willa watched from the east wing window as the lacquered carriage rolled out through the main gate, the 4 gray horses picking their way across the icy yard with delicate, displeased steps. Seraphine's brother rode alongside, his expression tight. Seraphine herself did not look back. The gate closed. Willa turned back to her work table. 3 months later, on the first warm day that truly felt like spring, the kind of day where the mud in the yard smells of possibility, and the oak tree in the inner courtyard shows the first tentative green at its branch tips. Edrin asked her a second question. He did it in the healing room, which was where most of the important things between them had happened, and Willa thought later that was fitting, that the room where she had spent her time making broken things well was also the room where something new had been built, carefully and without rush, until it was solid enough to stand on. He had been sitting across the table from her while she sorted the spring's first fresh herbs, telling her about a patrol report from the southern border, when he simply stopped talking mid-sentence and looked at her with an expression that had made a decision. Marry me, he said. Not because of the bond Tristan rejected, not to fill something that was emptied, because of who you are. He turned a clay pot slowly in his large hands. Because of the way you spoke to Pip when he was afraid. Because of the 3 nights you sat in Ashford and refused to leave until you were certain. Because you laughed in this room on a cold morning, and it was the most genuine thing I had heard inside these walls in years. He set the pot down. Because you are the only person in this castle who straightens things that don't need straightening and doesn't notice you do it. Willa looked down at her hands. She had, in fact, been straightening a bundle of sage that was already perfectly aligned. She looked up. Yes, she said. They were married in the castle's stone shrine on a morning in late spring, with the oak tree in full leaf visible through the narrow window, its shadow moving green and gold across the flagstones. Edrin wore a deep blue tunic and his good boots, newly tended. Willa wore her gray cloak over a dress of pale cream linen that one of the castle seamstresses had pressed into service, and she had braided the blue ribbon through her hair one final time, and then replaced it, at the last moment, with a wreath of small white flowers that grew along the castle's south wall. She had not expected what happened next. Tristan came. He arrived at the shrine doorway, as the moonkeeper was completing the binding words. And he stood at the back, not as a king performing a function, not as an audience, just as a man who had come because he needed to be there, bearing witness to the thing he had given away and had the grace to let go of properly. When it was done, he was the first to approach them. He clasped Edrin's hand, held it for a long moment, something passing between them that had no words. The long history of 2 men who had ridden into battle together and made each other's survival possible too many times to count, and which now included this particular cost and gift. Then he turned to Willa. He bowed his head, not a king's acknowledgement of a subject, but the genuine, unperformed bow of a man paying a debt that could not be repaid any other way. Be well, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. The pale eyes, the scar, The weight of what had been, and what would not be, carried between them one final time, and then, gently and with intention, set down. "And you," she said. He walked out of the shrine into the spring morning, and the oak tree's shadow moved across the empty doorway, and that was how it ended between them. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with the quiet and irrevocable dignity of a door closing on a room both of them had already left. That evening, Willa sat at the work table in the healing room. Her healing room now, in practice if not in title. She had begun teaching 2 young women who showed aptitude, and Marin would have approved. And she wrote in her journal by candlelight. She wrote the things she wanted to remember. The smell of Ashford in winter. The weight of Edrin's hand in hers. The sound of the oak tree moving in the spring wind through the shrine window. The specific quality of the light in the courtyard on the morning she had finally understood that choosing to stay did not mean choosing to be small. She wrote until the candle burned low, and then she closed the journal and pressed her palm against its cover for a moment in the quiet room. Outside, Caldenmoor settled into its spring night. The guards at their posts, the horses drowsing in the warm stable, the torches burning down in the empty corridors, the old oak standing patient in the dark courtyard, with its new leaves rustling in a soft wind that smelled of thaw and green things, and the particular promise that comes after long cold. Willa blew out the candle. She rose and crossed the room, and walked out of the healing room and toward the chambers that were now hers and Edrin's, and she did not look back. Not because she was afraid of what she would see, but because, for the first time in a very long time, everything she needed was in the direction she was already walking.